The afternoon sky over the Ruhr Valley hangs heavy with industrial haze on March 15, 1945, the kind of polluted air that turns sunlight into diffuse amber and makes altitude estimation difficult for pilots whose lives depend on knowing exactly how high they fly. Second Lieutenant Thomas Waverly guides his P-51D Mustang northward from the carnage of what was supposed to be a routine bomber escort mission, his hands trembling slightly on the control stick not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still floods his system 20 minutes after watching a B-17 explode in a fireball that consumed 10 men in an instant. He is 19 years old, has been flying combat operations for exactly 17 days, and carries in his cockpit the dubious distinction of being the newest replacement pilot in the 357 Fighter Group, so new that his squadron mates still call him the Kid, and his flight commander still questions whether he should be flying operationally at all. The radio crackles with the organized chaos of fighters reforming after engaging German interceptors, call signs and vectors and fuel states creating a symphony of controlled urgency that Waverly struggles to follow because his training, compressed into 8 months from civilian to combat pilot, never quite prepared him for the reality of keeping dozens of radio conversations straight while simultaneously flying an aircraft at 300 miles per hour through airspace where death could appear from any angle. Then his peripheral vision catches what his experience has not yet taught him to recognize instinctively: 9 dark shapes at his 2 o'clock high position, roughly 5,000 feet above him, turning in a coordinated formation that announces experienced pilots rather than the increasingly desperate and poorly trained Luftwaffe replacements that Allied intelligence briefs have described as the norm for March 1945. 9 Focke-Wulf 190s, late-model variants with the range and performance to operate deep over their own territory, flown by pilots who have somehow survived long enough to learn formation discipline in an air force that has been bleeding veterans for 3 years. The mathematics are immediate and brutal: 9 against 1, attackers with altitude and energy advantage, a lone defender who has been operational for barely 2 weeks and whose most sophisticated combat tactic to date has been trying not to get lost during patrol flights. Standard doctrine, the doctrine beaten into every fighter pilot from their first day of training, says this situation has only one solution: run. But Waverly, in a handful of seconds before those 9 FW-190s commit to their diving attack, makes a decision that will cause British radar operators monitoring the engagement to transmit abort it, he's too fast, over emergency channels, will force German pilots to file after-action reports that their squadron commanders will initially refuse to believe, and will demonstrate that. Sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming odds is not sophisticated tactics but simple speed applied with a desperation and single-mindedness that transforms physics into weapon. To understand why Waverly's response to being bounced by 9 German fighters violated everything the Army Air Forces taught about survival against superior numbers, one must first comprehend what American fighter doctrine had become by early 1945 and how that doctrine reflected hard lessons learned through 3 years of daylight strategic bombing over Europe. The P-51 Mustang, which Waverly flew that afternoon, represented the culmination of American fighter design philosophy: range sufficient to escort bombers deep into Germany, speed competitive with anything the Luftwaffe could field, armament heavy enough to destroy enemy aircraft with brief bursts. But the Mustang's capabilities came with specific tactical requirements that doctrine emphasized relentlessly. When engaged by superior numbers, particularly when those numbers held altitude advantage, the prescribed response was to call for help, maintain formation integrity if possible, use coordinated maneuvers to deny firing solutions, and disengage only when doing so would not expose other friendly aircraft to attack. The doctrine assumed reasonably that fighter pilots operated as parts of larger tactical elements, that mutual support between aircraft provided the foundation for survival, that no pilot would find himself completely alone against overwhelming odds because the fundamental structure of escort operations prevented such isolation. What doctrine did not adequately address was the situation Waverly now faced, separated from his squadron by the chaos of engagement, too far from other friendly fighters to coordinate support, facing enemies who had already achieved the tactical positioning that made coordinated evasion futile. The manual said call for help. The manual said maintain energy. The manual said use altitude and speed advantages that Waverly did not possess. What the manual did not say, because doctrine could not acknowledge it without admitting that sometimes pilots would be abandoned to situations where survival was improbable, was what to do when all the prescribed responses had already been foreclosed by circumstances. The German pilots who flew those 9 FW-190s expected to encounter an enemy whose responses to their attack would follow patterns established through hundreds of previous engagements, patterns refined through the systematic analysis that German tactical schools had applied to air combat since the Spanish Civil War. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine in March 1945, though increasingly hampered by fuel shortages and the degradation of training programs, retained the sophisticated understanding of energy management and coordinated attack that had made German fighter pilots so effective in the war's earlier years. The bounce from altitude, diving on an enemy fighter from above to use gravitational acceleration to build overwhelming speed advantage, represented one of the most fundamental tactics in aerial combat. The defender, spotting the attack, would typically brake hard into the attackers to spoil their deflection angles, would attempt to reverse the energy relationship by forcing the attackers to turn at speeds where their initial advantage would bleed away, would seek to create a maneuvering engagement where numbers mattered less than pilot skill and aircraft performance. All of these responses were logical, all had been proven effective when executed properly, and all required the defender to maneuver in ways that German pilots had learned to anticipate and counter. What German doctrine did not account for, what the systematic analysis of previous engagements had not revealed, was a defender who simply refused to engage at all, who converted his aircraft into a ballistic object aimed at the horizon and fled with a single-mindedness that made tactical considerations irrelevant. Waverley's decision to run, not the tactical disengagement that doctrine prescribed but a flat-out maximum power sprint for survival, emerged not from courage or cowardice but from a calculation so simple it bypassed conscious thought entirely. He was going to die if he stayed. 9 German fighters with altitude advantage would shred him regardless of how skillfully he maneuvered, regardless of whether he attempted the barrel rolls and scissors maneuvers that training had covered in theoretical lectures that seemed absurdly inadequate when facing the reality of cannon fire. The only variable he could control was distance, and distance required speed, and speed meant pushing his Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine to limits that peacetime testing had never anticipated and that wartime operations manuals cautioned against exceeding except in dire emergency. Waverley advanced the throttle past the maximum continuous power setting, past the war emergency power detent, into a range marked with warnings about engine damage and reduced service life, warnings that assumed the pilot cared about his engine surviving the next 100 hours when his more immediate concern was surviving the next 100 seconds. The Merlin responded with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat, the supercharger screaming as it forced compressed air into cylinders that converted fuel and oxygen into mechanical violence with an efficiency that British engineers had refined through years of development, but that Waverley understood only as the difference between living and dying. The sound of the Merlin at war emergency power became the symbolic element that defined the engagement and its meaning, not the measured rumble of cruise flight or the purposeful roar of combat power but rather an almost desperate shriek of machinery being asked to deliver performance beyond its design specifications, of metal and pistons and supercharger blades operating at temperatures and pressures that would, if sustained, cause progressive damage leading to eventual catastrophic failure. It was the sound of trading future capability for present survival, of accepting that the engine might need rebuilding after this mission if it meant there would be a pilot alive to fly the rebuilt engine. For Waverley, trapped in a cockpit that had become a cocoon of sound and vibration and the tunnel vision focus of absolute terror managed through forced action, that sound represented the only asset he possessed, raw speed that his attackers, despite their numbers and experience, would discover they could not match once the American pilot committed everything to the race. For the German pilots beginning their diving attack, confident in their tactical superiority and the mathematical inevitability of their success, that sound, if they could have heard it over their own engines and the rush of air over their canopies, would have been their first warning that this engagement would not proceed according to the patterns their training had taught them to expect. The transformation in the engagement's dynamics occurred not gradually, but with the suddenness of a switch being thrown, in the moment when Waverley's airspeed climbed through 400 miles per hour and continued accelerating. The FW-190s, diving to attack from their altitude advantage, had expected to close rapidly on a target that would maneuver defensively, would turn and twist and attempt to spoil firing solutions through violent motion. Instead, they found themselves pursuing a target that maintained straight-line flight, that refused to maneuver at all, that simply accelerated with a ferocity that turned pursuit geometry into a race. The lead German pilot, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, a veteran with 28 victories who had survived 3 years of combat through skill and situational awareness that kept him alive when so many of his contemporaries had died, would describe the engagement in an after-action report filed later that evening with frustration that bordered on disbelief. The lone Mustang, he reported, maintained level flight at speeds that exceeded what Luftwaffe intelligence assessments indicated the P-51 could sustain, speeds that meant his own aircraft, diving to build velocity, could not close the distance before the target would escape into the protective coverage of other Allied fighters. Weber's report noted with professional precision that the American pilot demonstrated no defensive maneuvering, and questioned whether the aircraft might be equipped with emergency boost systems not previously documented, a technical explanation for performance that seemed impossible according to known specifications. The British radar operators monitoring the engagement from ground stations in Holland, their screens showing the 9 German contacts pursuing a single Allied aircraft northward at speeds that made the raid markers blur across the plotting boards, transmitted on emergency frequencies reserved for situations requiring immediate command attention. Colville Leader, this is Rainbow Station. Single friendly pursuing vector 030 at speed we calculate 435 knots. 9 bandits in pursuit but losing closure. Please confirm status. The transmission, preserved in RAF records and declassified decades after the war, captured the confusion that ground controllers experienced watching an engagement that violated their understanding of tactical dynamics. 435 knots, nearly 500 miles per hour, represented speeds that fighters occasionally touched in dives but that no pilot sustained in level flight because the strain on airframe and engine made such speeds dangerous to maintain for more than brief periods. The controllers, assuming the American pilot was in desperate trouble and attempting escape through suicidal overspeeding, transmitted the abort order that would become part of squadron legend: "Abort, abort it, he's too fast. You cannot maintain that velocity. Reduce speed immediately." But Waverley, his radio tuned to his squadron frequency rather than the British control net, never heard the warning. He continued accelerating, his airspeed indicator now pushing past 450 miles per hour, entering a flight regime where the Mustang began vibrating in ways that suggested airframe components were approaching their stress limits. The German pilots, their initial confidence eroding as the distance to their target stabilized and then began increasing, attempted to adjust their tactics to accommodate what should have been impossible. The FW-190s, excellent aircraft with superior low-altitude performance to earlier German fighters, could achieve perhaps 420 miles per hour in level flight with engines at maximum power. But maximum power in the FW-190 was a sustainable setting, designed for combat operations that might require sustained high performance for extended periods. The Mustang's war emergency power, by contrast, was never intended for sustained use. It was a 5-minute boost for critical situations, powered by water methanol injection that cooled the supercharger and allowed higher boost pressures at the cost of increased fuel consumption and engine wear. Waverley had been at war emergency power for nearly 3 minutes, had consumed fuel at rates that would force him to land at the first available airfield rather than returning to his home base, and was generating power levels that would require his engine to be inspected and potentially replaced. But for those 3 minutes, he possessed a speed advantage that 9 German fighters, flying their aircraft within normal operational parameters, could not overcome. The desperation that drove Waverley to maintain speeds his training had taught him to avoid, that forced him to push his aircraft into a performance envelope where control became uncertain and failure modes became probable, reflected a transformation in how fighter combat was evolving by the war's final months. In 1943, when American fighters first began escorting bombers deep into Germany, engagements between German and American fighters had often been relatively evenly matched affairs where pilot skill and tactical positioning determined outcomes. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe had been bled white by attrition, its veteran pilots dead or grounded by fuel shortages, its replacement pilots receiving minimal training that left them vulnerable to even moderately experienced American opponents. But the Germans who had survived, the aces and experienced flight leaders like Weber who still flew operationally, were the best pilots the Luftwaffe had ever produced, men who had learned their craft in the unforgiving school of combat where mistakes were lethal and survival required excellence. Waverley, facing 9 aircraft led by such men, understood intuitively what his 17 days of combat experience could not articulate analytically, that attempting to dogfight opponents with such overwhelming advantages in numbers and experience would be suicide, that his only asset was an aircraft that, if tortured properly, could outrun anything the Germans flew. The desperation was not panic but rather a clear-eyed assessment that his life depended on speed and that everything else, engine longevity, fuel state, airframe stress, was irrelevant compared to not being shot down. The physical sensation of flying at such speeds, of pushing the Mustang into performance regimes its designers had tested but never intended for operational use, manifested in ways that Waverley would describe years later with the precision of someone recalling trauma. The control stick required constant attention, small corrections to counter the aircraft's tendency to yaw as asymmetric thrust from the propeller torque became more pronounced at maximum power. The vibration through the airframe made the instrument panel difficult to read, the gauges blurring enough that he could not precisely track his airspeed and relied instead on the sound of the engine and the feel of the aircraft to judge how close he was to the edge of controllability. The visibility through the canopy was reduced by the oil film that crept across the windscreen when the engine ran at such high temperatures, forcing him to look around the film rather than through it. And over all of this, the sound, that shrieking mechanical violence of an engine operating at the absolute limit of what metallurgy and engineering could tolerate, a sound that announced to anyone listening that this was not normal flight but rather controlled emergency, crisis refined into forward motion. The mathematics of pursuit, the geometry that governed how aircraft closing at high speed could or could not achieve firing positions, worked against the German pilots with the same implacable logic that had worked against countless other attackers throughout the war. The FW-190s, diving from altitude to build speed, had committed to a specific energy state, high velocity but descending flight path that could not be sustained indefinitely without impacting terrain. Weber, recognizing that his formation could not catch the fleeing Mustang while maintaining their dive, made the tactical decision to level out and attempt to sustain pursuit in horizontal flight. But leveling out bled the speed they had built in the dive, and once level, the FW-190s simply could not match the Mustang's velocity. The distance between hunter and hunted, which had been closing at the engagement start, stabilized at approximately 3,000 yards and then began inexorably increasing. 3,000 yards, roughly 1.5 miles, represented the effective maximum range for fighter-to-fighter gunnery, the distance beyond which deflection shooting became more hope than skill. As that distance increased to 4,000 yards, then 5,000, Weber faced a decision that every fighter pilot dreaded: continue a pursuit that was clearly futile, burning fuel and exposing his formation to possible counterattack from other Allied fighters, or break off and accept that somehow, impossibly, a lone American pilot had escaped 9 coordinated attackers through nothing more sophisticated than running faster than physics said should be possible. The British radar operators, watching their screens as the 9 German contacts fell progressively behind the lone Allied aircraft, transmitted updated situation reports that reflected their growing realization that what they were witnessing was not a pilot about to die from overstressing his aircraft but rather a pilot who had discovered, accidentally or intentionally, that the P-51 possessed a sprint capability that exceeded known performance specifications. Rainbow Station to Colville Leader, single friendly has open distance to bandits approximately 8,000 yards and increasing. Bandits appear to be breaking off pursuit. Status of friendly unknown but aircraft still maintaining heading and speed. The professional detachment in the controller's voice could not entirely mask the undercurrent of surprise, the recognition that they had just observed an engagement that challenged their understanding of what fighter aircraft could do. The report that followed, filed through channels to RAF Fighter Command and copied to American 8th Air Force Headquarters, would initiate a formal investigation into P-51 performance capabilities under emergency conditions, would lead to revised understanding of what the Mustang could achieve when pilots were willing to accept engine damage as the price for escape, and would quietly filter into the operational knowledge that experienced pilots shared with new replacements but that never quite made it into official manuals. The German after-action reports, compiled from the accounts of all 9 FW-190 pilots who participated in the engagement, revealed frustration and confusion in equal measure. Weber's detailed description of the pursuit, supported by his wingman's observations, noted times and speeds and distances with the precision of a professional trying to understand what had gone wrong. The consensus among the German pilots was that they had been outperformed not by superior tactics or better aircraft, but by an American willingness to operate their equipment in ways that German pilots, trained to preserve their aircraft for sustained operations, would not have considered. Oberleutnant Hans Richter, flying as Weber's wingman, wrote in his personal diary that evening that the American pilot flew as though his aircraft was expendable, as though he had unlimited aircraft available and could afford to destroy this one's engine through abuse if it meant escaping us. We flew as professionals. He flew as someone who understood that survival mattered more than proper procedure. This observation, made by a pilot who would himself be killed 3 weeks later during the defense of the airfield at Parchim, captured a fundamental difference in how the two air forces approached equipment management by the war's end. The Luftwaffe, starved for resources and unable to replace damaged aircraft or worn-out engines, had to fly conservatively to preserve scarce equipment. The Americans, supported by industrial capacity that produced aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, could afford tactical decisions that sacrificed equipment for pilot survival. Waverley's fuel state, as his airspeed finally began decreasing from the sustained emergency power run, had deteriorated to the point where returning to his home base at Leiston was impossible. The fuel gauges, which he had largely ignored during the pursuit phase when his immediate survival seemed more important than his eventual fuel exhaustion, now showed levels that required an immediate landing at whatever Allied airfield he could reach. He transmitted on his squadron frequency, his voice still tight with the adrenaline that was only beginning to ebb, reporting his position and requesting vectors to the nearest friendly field. The response came not from his squadron but from a British controller who had been monitoring the engagement. Colville 57, Vector 280 for 8 miles. RAF Coltishall has emergency equipment standing by. What is nature of your emergency? Waverley, still processing what had just happened, replied with the understatement that would become legend in his squadron: no emergency. Just fast. The transmission, recorded on the communications logs that tracked all radio traffic in the sector, became one of the most frequently quoted exchanges in 8th Air Force mess hall conversations, a moment of dark humor that captured the weird mixture of terror and triumph that characterized fighter combat. The landing at Coltishall, executed with fuel gauges showing levels so low that ground crews would later find less than 5 gallons remaining in the tanks, revealed damage to Waverley's Mustang that made his escape seem even more improbable in retrospect. The engine, when examined by British maintenance personnel, showed signs of thermal stress that indicated it had been operated at temperatures exceeding design specifications for extended periods. The exhaust stacks had discolored from heat. The oil showed metal. Particles that suggested bearing surfaces had approached failure. The propeller governor, which controlled blade pitch to maintain optimal engine RPM, had begun to malfunction from the sustained high-power operation. The aircraft, in the assessment of the senior engineering officer at Coltishall, was operationally unserviceable and would require engine replacement before it could be returned to combat operations. But Waverley was alive, was standing on the wing of his aircraft describing the engagement to an audience of British pilots and ground crew, who listened with a mixture of professional interest and vicarious terror that characterized how fighter pilots process stories of survival against impossible odds. The transformation in how Waverley's squadron mates viewed him evolved over the days following the engagement, as the story spread through the informal networks that connected fighter groups and as the official reports made their way through intelligence channels to analysts who tried to extract tactical lessons from individual combat experiences. The initial reaction, when Waverley first described being bounced by 9 FW-190s and escaping through straight-line flight at emergency power, was skepticism that suggested he had either misidentified the number of attackers or had been fortunate that they were inexperienced pilots who had bungled their attack. But the radar plots confirmed the numbers: 9 German aircraft pursuing a single American for nearly 5 minutes across 50 miles. The British controller's transmissions confirmed the speeds, velocities that exceeded what most pilots believed the P-51 could sustain. And the German reports, captured after the war when archives were opened and former Luftwaffe pilots were interviewed, confirmed that the attacking unit had been led by experienced pilots rather than the poorly trained replacements that were becoming common by March 1945. Waverley's squadron mates, confronted with evidence that contradicted their initial skepticism, gradually shifted from viewing him as lucky to viewing him as someone who had discovered, accidentally or intentionally, a tactical response that doctrine had not considered because doctrine assumed pilots would not be willing to destroy their engines to escape. The official investigation into P-51 performance under emergency conditions, initiated by 8th Air Force Headquarters in response to the Coltishall incident and several similar reports of Mustangs achieving unexpectedly high speeds during combat, produced findings that quietly revised how fighter groups understood their aircraft's capabilities. The investigation, conducted by engineering officers who combined combat pilot experience with technical knowledge, determined that P-51s equipped with a British-built Packard Merlin engine could, under specific conditions, achieve speeds in excess of 450 miles per hour in level flight when pilots were willing to use war emergency power beyond the recommended 5-minute limit. The performance required specific conditions, high-grade fuel, properly maintained engines, pilots willing to accept that their engines would likely require replacement after such abuse. But the performance was real, was reproducible, and represented a capability that had existed all along but had not been exploited because doctrine and training emphasized engine preservation over maximum performance. The investigation's report, circulated to fighter group commanders with instructions to brief pilots on emergency capabilities without encouraging reckless engine abuse, acknowledged in carefully bureaucratic language that sometimes survival required violating peacetime engineering principles and that the industrial capacity to replace damaged engines made such violations acceptable when the alternative was losing trained pilots. The German Luftwaffe's response to reports of American fighters achieving sustained speeds that exceeded known P-51 specifications reflected an institution struggling to adapt to circumstances where the fundamental assumptions of aerial combat were shifting. Throughout 1944 and into early 1945, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had been predicated on the belief that German fighters, particularly the late-model FW-190s and Me-109s, could compete with American fighters on roughly equal terms when flown by experienced pilots. The superior numbers that Americans could field would be offset by superior German pilot training and by the advantage of fighting over home territory where damaged aircraft could land at nearby fields and where pilots who bailed out could return to combat after rescue. But encounters like Weber's pursuit of Waverley suggested that American pilots were willing to operate their aircraft in ways that German pilots, constrained by fuel shortages and limited replacement capacity, could not match. The Luftwaffe could not afford to have pilots routinely destroy their engines through abuse because replacement engines were scarce and installation capacity was limited. The Americans, apparently, could afford such tactical decisions because their industrial capacity made engines expendable in ways that German logistics could not sustain. Waverley himself, in the days following the engagement, struggled to articulate what had happened in terms that made tactical sense to pilots who asked how he had known that running at emergency power would work. The honest answer was that he had not known, had simply reacted to the certainty that staying to fight would be fatal and that the only variable he could control was speed. The decision to push the engine beyond limits had not been calculated risk assessment, but rather desperation that accepted potential engine failure as preferable to certain death from cannon fire. But as he tried to explain his thinking to younger pilots who looked to him as someone who had survived the unsurvivable, Waverley began to recognize that perhaps his desperation had contained an element of tactical wisdom that formal training had not emphasized. The doctrine that stressed engine preservation, that warned against exceeding performance limitations, had been written in circumstances where aircraft and engines were scarce and where losing equipment through abuse was considered worse than losing engagements through insufficient performance. By March 1945, those circumstances had changed. American fighter production had reached levels where engines could be replaced easily, where the limiting factor was not equipment but trained pilots. The tactical calculation that said preserve your engine had been superseded by a new calculation that said preserve yourself even if it means destroying your engine, because trained pilots were now more valuable than mechanical components. The sound of the Merlin at war emergency power, that shrieking mechanical desperation that had accompanied Waverley's escape, became for him a reminder of a larger truth about warfare and survival and the relationship between doctrine and circumstance. Doctrine existed to provide guidance based on accumulated experience, to prevent individual pilots from making decisions that would waste resources or expose them to unnecessary risk. But doctrine could not anticipate every situation, could not account for circumstances where all the preferred tactical options had been foreclosed by enemy action or by the chaos of combat. In those circumstances, survival belonged to pilots who could recognize when doctrine no longer applied, who could accept that doing something the manual said not to do might be the only thing that worked. The sound of that engine being tortured beyond its specifications was the sound of desperation refined into tactic, of rules being violated because following rules would have meant dying, of a 19-year-old replacement pilot discovering through necessity what experienced pilots might have dismissed as impossible. By April 1945, as the European war ground toward its conclusion and Allied air superiority over Germany had become so complete that Luftwaffe fighter resistance was sporadic and disorganized, the story of the rookie who escaped 9 FW-190s through pure speed had achieved a kind of legendary status in fighter pilot culture. It was told in ready rooms and mess halls, embellished through retelling until some versions had Waverly escaping dozens of German fighters or achieving speeds that would have torn the wings off his aircraft. But beneath the embellishment lay the core truth that made the story meaningful, that a pilot with less than 3 weeks of combat experience had survived an encounter that should have killed him, not through superior tactics or brilliant maneuvering but through the simple expedient of flying faster than his enemies could follow. The story resonated because it challenged the romantic notion of aerial combat as a test of skill where the better pilot prevailed, suggested instead that sometimes survival was a matter of having better equipment and being willing to abuse that equipment in ways that doctrine had not anticipated. The British radar operators who had transmitted abort it, he's too fast, became, in the retelling, emblematic of the institutional confusion that sometimes occurred when individual pilots discovered capabilities that official assessments had not documented. The operators, trained to monitor engagements and provide tactical guidance based on known aircraft performance, had interpreted Waverly's sustained high-speed flight as a pilot losing control or making a desperate mistake that would lead to aircraft failure. Their abort transmission, meant as warning to prevent what they saw as imminent disaster, instead became evidence that sometimes the impossible was actually possible, that the limits everyone believed were absolute were actually more flexible than peacetime testing had revealed. The phrase "he's too fast" entered fighter pilot vocabulary as shorthand for situations where someone was operating outside normal parameters, where rules were being violated, where disaster seemed imminent but might actually be calculated risk that people watching did not understand. The 9 German pilots who had pursued Waverly, whose after-action reports documented their frustration and confusion at being unable to catch what should have been easy prey, represented the other side of the technological and industrial equation that defined aerial combat by the war's end. They had flown their aircraft professionally, had maintained formation discipline, had executed tactics that reflected years of institutional knowledge refined through combat experience. But they had been defeated not by superior American tactics but by superior American resources, by an opponent who could afford to destroy engines as the price for saving pilots, who could replace damaged aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, who could train replacement pilots in sufficient numbers that losing aircraft to mechanical abuse was acceptable if it meant those pilots survived to fly again. The Germans, constrained by shortages that forced them to preserve equipment even when preservation meant accepting tactical disadvantages, could not match American willingness to trade material for survival. The statistical analysis of fighter combat in early 1945, compiled by operational research sections that tried to extract quantifiable lessons from thousands of individual engagements, showed patterns that Waverly's escape exemplified. American fighter losses to German aircraft had declined not primarily because American pilots had become more skilled, though experience certainly mattered, but because American fighters had become more willing to use their aircraft's full performance envelope when circumstances required maximum capability. The P-51, when flown by pilots willing to accept engine damage, possessed a speed advantage over late-war German fighters that was larger than paper specifications suggested, because paper specifications assumed normal operational parameters rather than emergency conditions. This performance advantage, combined with overwhelming American numerical superiority, meant that German fighters increasingly found themselves in situations where their tactical options were limited. They could not catch fleeing American fighters, could not disengage from pursuing American fighters, and could not accept combat on terms that gave them advantage. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war with tactical and technological advantages that had dominated European skies for 2 years, found itself by 1945 defeated not by superior enemy tactics, but by industrial capacity that allowed enemies to operate their equipment in ways German logistics could not sustain. Waverley's Mustang, after receiving a replacement engine and being returned to operational status 3 weeks after the emergency landing at Colteschall, carried a mission tally on its fuselage that would eventually reach 112 combat sorties, a number that represented not just Waverley's survival but the survival of the aircraft through circumstances that might have destroyed it if its pilot had been less fortunate or less willing to push beyond limits. The engine that had been removed, its bearings worn beyond serviceable limits and its cylinder heads cracked from thermal stress, was shipped back to depot maintenance where it was analyzed as part of the investigation into P-51 performance under emergency conditions. The analysis concluded that the engine had operated at temperatures approximately 200 degrees above maximum sustained specifications for periods totaling nearly 8 minutes across the engagement, temperatures that peacetime testing had indicated would cause rapid failure, but that wartime necessity had proven could be tolerated for brief periods when circumstances required maximum performance. The transformation in fighter tactics that followed from engagements like Waverley's, documented in training revisions and tactical bulletins distributed throughout 8th Air Force fighter groups in spring 1945, reflected grudging institutional acknowledgement that individual pilots had discovered capabilities that formal testing had not revealed. The revised guidance did not explicitly endorse sustained emergency power operation. Doing so would have required acknowledging that the original limitations had been too conservative, but it did note that pilots facing extreme circumstances might find that their aircraft could briefly exceed published performance specifications, and that such exceedances, while not recommended for routine operations, were tactically acceptable in emergency situations where pilot survival depends on maximum aircraft capability. This bureaucratic language, carefully phrased to avoid directly contradicting earlier guidance, represented a compromise between engineering conservatism and combat reality, an acknowledgement that sometimes the rules had to bend because the alternative was losing pilots who might have survived if they had known their aircraft could do more than the manual said. The sound of that Merlin at emergency power, shrieking through the cold air above the Ruhr Valley as it pushed a rookie pilot beyond the reach of 9 experienced enemies, echoed beyond the immediate moment of one man's desperate flight. It resonated through the squadrons that heard the story, through the pilots who found themselves in similar situations and remembered that maybe their aircraft could do more than they had been taught, through the quiet revision of tactical doctrine that acknowledged what combat had proven, that limits were sometimes more flexible than specifications suggested, that survival sometimes required violating rules, that being too fast was better than being dead. The sound announced, to anyone who understood its meaning, that American industrial capacity had created a weapon system where the weak point was no longer the machine, but rather the willingness of pilots to use that machine to its absolute limits. German pilots, flying excellent aircraft that they had to preserve because replacements were scarce, found themselves repeatedly defeated by American pilots flying in a way that their logistics could not sustain, that their institutional culture could not embrace, that their tactical doctrine could not counter. And so we return to that afternoon over the Ruhr Valley, to Second Lieutenant Thomas Waverley at 19 years old with 17 days of combat experience, to the moment when 9 FW-190s appeared above him and doctrine said he was about to die. The decision that followed, to push the throttle forward and commit everything to speed, was not tactical brilliance or strategic insight but rather the simplest possible response to impossible circumstances: run faster than they can chase. The Merlin engine that responded to that throttle input, that delivered power beyond what peacetime engineers had thought wise to allow, that shrieked its mechanical protest while doing exactly what was asked of it, represented the industrial and material advantage that would ultimately decide the war's outcome as much as any battle or campaign. The British radar operators who watched the engagement unfold on their screens, who transmitted their abort warning, because what they were seeing seemed impossible, spoke a truth they did not intend, that he was too fast, that he had exceeded the bounds of what doctrine said was possible, that sometimes the rookie who survived was the rookie who discovered that rules were guidelines rather than limits, and that survival belonged to those willing to break guidelines when following them meant dying. The 9 German pilots who broke off their pursuit after 5 minutes of watching their target pull steadily away from them, who filed reports that questioned whether American fighters had secret modifications or whether their own aircraft had been somehow deficient, were experiencing the realization that their training and skill and institutional knowledge could not overcome an opponent who possessed the material advantage to fly without the constraints that limited their own operations. The phrase that emerged from that engagement, "Abort, abort it, he's too fast," became more than a warning about one pilot's desperate escape. It became an epitaph for German air superiority, acknowledgement that the side that could afford to be too fast, that could afford to destroy engines in exchange for saving pilots, that could replace equipment faster than it could be lost, possessed an advantage that skill and courage could not overcome. In the sound of that Merlin at war emergency power, shrieking beyond its design specifications because a rookie pilot needed speed more than he needed an engine that would last another 100 hours, lay the truth about how industrial wars are won, not through tactical elegance or strategic brilliance alone, but through the relentless application of material superiority, through the willingness to trade machines for men, through the simple physics of being able to go faster than your enemy can follow because you have more engines waiting when the one you are abusing finally fails. Waverley's escape, that desperate 5-minute sprint across the skies of Germany, was individual survival written in engine temperatures and airspeed indicators and fuel consumption. But it was also a metaphor for the larger strategic truth of 1945, that Allied victory would come not from fighting better, but from fighting with resources that Axis powers could no longer match, from being willing and able to push equipment beyond limits because abundant industrial capacity made replacement possible, from the accumulated advantage of being too fast in too many